Hello and welcome to the very first episode of Artifactually Speaking. I'm Brad Hafford, archaeologist and specialist in the ancient world.
And I'm Tom Pedrick. I'm a historian of modern European history.
And our vidcast, if you want to call it that, whatever this is all about artifacts, but not what you might think of as artifact, since that usually applies to very ancient objects. And I work with that sort of thing in my work in the museum and in the field when I'm excavating. But those sorts of things, the really ancient stuff, is part of world heritage and something that needs to be studied in museums, really. Most people are not going to have access to them. And yet we do have objects that have a lot of meaning in our daily lives, things that we might find in our attics or things that our family had owned. And you can go beyond that and find things in thrift stores, perhaps. And that sounds a bit silly, because isn't everything just sort of there, just thrown away? Kind of. But it had meaning at a time, and we can uncover that. We can learn a lot from things that seem pretty mundane. In fact, almost anything, really anything that is made by people is an artifact, even something recent. So, for instance, I have a coffee mug here. And it has some meaning to me because it has the emblem of the university where I got my PhD. So that's a personal attachment, a kind of thing that maybe only people who went to the university could feel, but I think we can understand it because there are emblems like that that mean something to us personally, and we can find out about things that meant things to other people in the past. So my point is that by studying objects, even casually asking questions of those objects, we learn something about our own past and about the time period that went before us, whenever that time period was. And Tom, you and I have had these sorts of discussions all the time, and we thought there would be a lot of people who are interested in this. In fact, we discovered a set of what you might call trivia cards published in 1898. And you and I have had a lot of fun just sitting there and reading these cards, not trying to show that we know all of this stuff, but rather to understand why people in that late Victorian era would ask these sorts of questions in their parlors, and what was it they wanted to know.
Absolutely. And we were looking at what sort of historical ideas and events did they think were most important.
We learned a lot, I think. And we can do that from almost anything. So in each of our episodes, we are going to address two different objects from the same period, or they'll be linked in theme or time period or geography, sometimes all of those. And those two objects, I think, will lead us to a much bigger discussion, not just about this tiny thing that might be mundane, but we'll try to understand what do they mean. And that's sometimes a difficult thing to come to. In fact, objects have a great many stories embedded within them. So what we're doing is acting like journalists, but we alter the standard journalists' questions of who, what, when, where, why, and how by starting with what? It's an object, so we want to figure out what it is, and that seems like a pretty obvious question. My coffee mug is a coffee mug, and isn't that the end of the story? Not really, because what is it is one thing, what does it mean? So those symbols on it also have something to do with it. What shape is it made in and why? Doesn't that tell us something about the time period?
That's absolutely right. And I'd just like to add that none of these so-called questions of the artifactualist are obvious. For example, when could mean when was it found or when was it made? And if you're asking when was it made, you have to know something like if a particular material was scarce in a particular decade. Maybe they switched materials. That can tell us quite a bit.
And it could be something like, when was it rediscovered? Maybe it has been sitting in a garage for 30 years.
Absolutely.
And you stumbled across it and you ask questions about it, and maybe someone is still around who had used that, and you ask them, what was this and what did it mean to you? That's great. But if it's been 80 years, 100 years, that's harder to do, and we've got to start looking at all the evidence around it and maybe find, I don't know, advertisements for it, newspaper articles. And that makes me want to study it. It's not just opening a book and reading about history. History in schools is sometimes taught just as open a book, learn these dates and names, memorize them, and spit them back out on a test.
Yeah, too frequently kids are just taught to memorize a succession of dates and a bunch of names, and they don't know how any of these facts interact with each other. They don't understand the greater context, or they don't get a sense of what it would have felt like to be alive then.
Right, and so consequently, they don't understand why that would be interesting. But I think by examining some of these things, we do get deeply interested in them and want to know more. Then we find something else that is surprising. So today, we're going to look at objects that I think are right up your alley, really. One of your periods of study, if I'm
Sure,
correct, is the First World War.
definitely. This is a really
So
fascinating time period.
it is indeed, and let's go to our first official artifact.
So, this is a pin from an organization called the American Fund for French Wounded. And on the cover, it contains a standard appeal to patriotism. It already mentions in the title America and France, so naturally we have both flags, and with the emblem Long Live France. It contains red, white, and blue, which coincidentally are the colors of both nations. But it also has a rooster on the front. Have you ever
Yeah,
seen that before, Brad?
I have on some of the coins of the French, in particularly in this period.
It's called the Gallic rooster. And we can never exactly know how this came about. It's because it's been used for so long. There's a couple ideas. One being that France has historically been a great agricultural country. Another one being that it's a bit of a pun. Gallus was the Latin word for rooster. Gaul was the Roman province of what we today call France. So therefore, there was a association with France being the rooster, going back to ancient times.
I'm going to switch over to the close-up camera now to show this pin a little bit more specifically. And there is that Gallic rooster up on the top in red enamel, and the two flags in Vive la France. All over the outer edge, of course, it says the American Fund for French Wounded. And on the back, we can see a kind of screw. This is how it, I guess, was worn.
Right. We typically call it a lapel pin, even though it's not literally a pin.
Uh-huh.
In the opening on a lapel, in either a suit or an overcoat, you would just screw this through, and the little sharp edge there would help stabilize it on.
Right, because sometimes you would wear a boutonniere, I guess, on a lapel, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So we have to get to our next question, though, the all important when.
Right.
So this institution, the American Fund for French Wounded, was in operation from 1915 to 1919. So it was roughly coterminous with World War I, which was 1914 to 1918. So the association itself actually predates American involvement in World War I.
Right, because America entered, well, late, I guess, 1917, right? Something like
Right, 1917, America declares war. Now, we'd also have to get to our question of where. Where was it worn? Where was it sold? This association came about as a result of expatriate American women living in France. They wanted to help France because it saw tremendous suffering and death in World War I.
that. Yeah.
Its hospitals were overrun with wounded. They wanted to help get them supplies. But they also had a headquarters in New York City. So I think it's safe to say we can imagine men and women, socially conscious men and women, wearing this on both sides of the Atlantic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in fact, World War I was terrifying. Well, all war is terrifying, but with the advent of modern technology and the ability to kill even more people in war, it became particularly horrifying with the new use of tanks and airplanes and much faster machine guns and things like this.
Absolutely. And having large numbers of soldiers charge these machine gun pits
Mm-hmm.
just saw slaughter on an epic scale. In fact, one of the nicknames for the Western Front was the human meat grinder because it just went through that many lives.
But I think it devastated the economy as well. This is the thing that I really study, even in the ancient world, is economics. How do people conduct trade and interact? And in warfare, it's particularly complicated. So Our next object will relate to that, because when you wanted to talk about World War I thought about what could I show, and it is another artifact. Paper money, fairly obvious. It says 1 franc, so that's what it was evaluated at. But it's unusual because this is what we might term emergency money. Often, when wars come about, in fact, almost always, you issue a kind of IOU instead of putting out there money that people recognize and trust, which is typically precious metals. At this time, most coinage was made of silver. Of course, the lower denominations were often made of copper. But when you go to warfare, you've got to use your gold and silver reserves in order to support the war effort by buying munitions, etc., from other nations using gold and silver, because that's what they'll accept. Meanwhile, in your domestic economy, you utilize a kind of emergency currency. So you write IOUs and tell the people that we need to win this war, and so use these pieces of paper. When the war is over, we'll go back to the kind of money that you trust. Unfortunately, that almost never happens because you're trying to pay for that war effort long after the war is over. And so people usually don't trust this money. They will use it. And in this case, the one that we just saw here, showing the back of it now, République Française, and it shows that this note will be reimbursed at the cessation of hostilities between the armies. So they knew that they couldn't guarantee when the war would end. And in some cases, they were to be reimbursed as many as 5 years after the cessation of hostilities, and usually they weren't reimbursed at all. In fact, France was still issuing silver currency until somewhere around 1916. I have another note that I want to show, which I find maybe even more interesting because this one is more heavily used. So I can imagine it being in many pockets and circulating all around in this wartime. But one of the other interesting things is that on the right, it shows what a 1 franc coin would look like in 1915. So this is a stand-in for a coin, even though it's not really backed the same way. So that's what it is, a form of currency. When? Well, this one's issued in 1917. And the where? Right there in France. And in fact, that second note that we saw was issued in Belfort, and it was issued by the Chamber of Commerce, whereas the first one is issued by the Treasury of the Army. So, well, they're supporting military action, really. And in fact, this note has a lot of imagery, and that imagery is used by governments to send a message. It's a kind of propaganda, really. And in this case, what we see is a soldier returning home. So he is coming back from the battlefield, and the family dog is already greeting him right at his knee. And over on the other side, we see his family, his wife with open arms and his daughter. One of them raises a laurel wreath, which is indicative of heroism. So this imagery, in this case, is trying to say, we can survive this war. We will make it. Your husbands, brothers, fathers will come home. Unfortunately, that wasn't always true. As we've already referred to, a whole lot did die, but some did come home.
Sure, and one thing I love about that imagery is that it's clearly a peasant family, and it's clearly displaying the sacrifice of the average French soldier and his family.
Well, in this kind of horror, it tears at our heartstrings, and it will sometimes create a kind of altruism. And I think that refers to the kind of lapel pin that you're looking at.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Human tragedy can inspire great pity and concern. And this reminds us of a broader trend in history, particularly beginning in the 19th century. So the American Fund for French Wounded worked and helped the International Red Cross, which was a big purveyor of supplies on the Western Front. The International Red Cross got its start in a terrible war scenario. It was the Second War of Italian Independence. There was a battle called Solferino, which for its time, it was the biggest battle in European history after Waterloo. It
Wow.
was tremendous,
Mm-hmm.
and it inspired such pity. There was a Swiss witness that he went on to co-found the International Committee of the Red Cross in the 1860s. There's a very similar situation in the United States, where I believe in 1881, the former American Civil War nurse, Clara Barton, helped to found the American Red Cross.
Mm-hmm.
She had seen horrible things and horrible conditions in these military field hospitals. And we're seeing something somewhat similar with the American Fund for French Wounded.
Exactly.
As we said, America wasn't in the war, but still, people felt tremendous pity and sorrow for what was going on, and they wanted to
Sure.
help.
Of course. Exactly. So the Red Cross itself is pretty well known, and I think their symbolism is recognizable more so than, say, a French rooster. So I'm going to show again some small objects here. What we have are two Red Cross pins, and it's just that broad red cross on a white background. And these, though, are very thin tin. They're a bit later than what we're talking about. They're probably 1950s or 60s. And those are very quickly made, just struck out and printed on the tin. Whereas our other lapel pin here, that's earlier than 15 or so, is much more substantial, brass and enamel. So that's part of our how question, I think. How is it made anyway? There's a lot of other hows.
Absolutely. And the pin for the American Fund for French Wounded is not only more substantial, it's more specific. The Red Cross pin you could imagine supporting almost any effort. Earlier, I had speculated that the pin for the American Fund for French Wounded would have been worn by people of high society. And what makes that come to mind is that it was founded by expatriates. So I imagine some well-to-do people. However, anybody who was conscious and concerned with the situation in France really could have worn it.
Yeah, I think that's certainly true. Even today, there are plenty of charities where we will donate, and maybe they give you one of those wristbands, or sometimes it's a pin, and you wear it just to show support. That, yes, I believe in this cause.
Sure, and I particularly remember in high school, the Lance Armstrong wristband was all the rage.
Right. So I'll get into a little bit of the how on the notes. Here, of course, is the paper Chamber of Commerce note, and that's fairly obvious. They are printed on, well, what most people think of as paper. It's usually a linen-cotton mix so that it will survive in circulation a lot more. It's printed in many different colors, etc., to try and make sure people won't counterfeit. And that's still a big issue, even with these kinds of IOUs. You want to make sure that people aren't cheating the system. The why? Well, we've spoken about the why. People needed something to conduct daily business. Even though there was a war on, there's still people out there, farmers, etc., having to grow food and help to supply the troops as well as themselves just to get by in daily life. And so you do need a kind of currency in most situations to go and get things that you can't make yourself.
Sure, and I also think there's a sense of optimism and hope in that fiat currency.
Sure.
It's this is the best my government can do, and they promise to pay me back. Now, whether
Yeah.
or not that actually happened is a different story, but you could imagine somebody in 1916, they've already lived through a couple years of war, and they're just holding on to some hope that everything's going to turn out all right.
Mm-hmm. I do wonder about that sometimes when I teach about money and talk about all of the messages that they carry. How many people, though, do really look at it? You know, do you ever pick
Right.
up a dollar bill or something and go, oh yeah, I'm proud of my nation? Well, you could say it's just sort of embedded in there, and we naturally absorb the message that it is carrying. Because if it puts an image that people don't agree with, they'll tell you about it, I think.
Yeah, of course.
So the who? Well, pretty much anyone in France. They would have to use this in their daily activities. So I like to try to imagine the person that was using this. And that's why I like the very worn note, because I can picture someone folding it up. It has these heavy folds in it, and putting it in their pocket, and then taking it to market or whatever, buying something, and then that gets handed out as change. So it has been in so many hands in an interesting and very difficult, problematic, troublesome time in history, and that connects me directly to that time. I certainly would not want to be in battle, but I can start to understand people that were affected directly by it and maybe even participating. So we've kind of gotten to our questions, and we have shown, I think, the depth of learning we can get from some fairly simple objects. We do want to talk about that bigger picture a little more, maybe. One of the things that I think will help us to wrap this up is a postcard that I have, dated 1919. And this is in France, and it is an American troop carrier. In the background there, it's labeled on the negative USS Powhatan, and it says all aboard for USA. So look at all of these troops going home. And that, I guess, is that message. War does end, but problems are still there. There's a whole lot of difficulties throughout the interwar period. But this image, to me, really speaks volumes. There are so many troops here, and I think one of them has an American flag on his backpack right there. So France was still home to a whole lot of troops, and they were trying to get back home. One of the other interesting things about that photograph is that the USS Powhatan had been named before this the USS Red Cross. So for several years in the First World War, it was a hospital ship, and that's why it was called USS Red Cross. It was renamed and turned into a troop carrier in order mainly to bring troops back home from Europe.
That's quite interesting. And something else that really strikes me about the photo is that it was, like you said, taken in 1919. So not long after the cessation of hostilities, mass amounts of American soldiers went home very quickly. I can't imagine that logistical effort.
It's true. And it is interesting to imagine that sort of thing. You know, so often we talk about the battles and how the war was won, and we don't think so much about just how much effort there was in preparation and the people at home who were making things for the war effort, and then the logistics of bringing so many troops home, because although a lot died, and that's terrible, many did survive, and of course they had to get back home and get reintegrated into society. It is so full of interesting thought and stories, things that I had not considered before. And that's exactly what we want to try to bring out. And we will continue to look at objects in other episodes. We will always bring in two, and I think they will lead us to really great discussions.
Yeah, and I just want to say I think we're off to a great start. And I can think of a bunch of other questions I want to answer just from these objects themselves.
Exactly. We have not gotten all of the stories out of these objects, and we will never get them all, but that's the great thing. You can go back and look at them and think about new things. So, thanks for joining us on this first episode of Artifactually Speaking. I'm Brad Hafford.
And I'm Tom Pedrick.
Join us again on the next Artifactually Speaking.
Until next time.